for Michael of talking about something brand new with machine learning. I'm going to talk about something very more down to earth of things that I think almost all of us work with on a daily basis, and that's orchestrating Symfony for the enterprise. I'm very excited to be here. So a little bit about me. I am Kristen Costagliola. I'm a principal engineer at Datto. We do data protection and business continuity for businesses all across the globe. We get to solve a lot of really, really cool problems and things that people actually have never done before. This is me like absolutely cheesing at Glacier National Park this summer. I'm really big into outdoors, hiking, camping, playing ultimate frisbee. So, why am I here? What am I going to talk about? And how can I help you? I've been at Datto for the last 3.5 years, and we've gone from a startup to an enterprise company. And so my goal today is to kind of help you learn the things that we did over the last 3.5 years, all the things we've changed, questions to ask yourself as you're in these same situations. Hopefully you won't make the same mistakes we did, and you can have a better environment than we do now. So I want to set something straight. When I say enterprise, I'm not talking about the Starship Enterprise. We usually also think of Oracles or Amazons when we hear the word enterprise. But when you actually look up the definition, it really just means any business or company. I think that's a huge gap between what we think about as humans and what the definition is. So in my mind, I really think of enterprise as any company that has 2 development teams working on the same product. You're sharing the same information across multiple people. So I'm going to start with where Datto was when I started in 2015. We had 3 small development offices. We did have 3 different products that we were developing on. We had 4 absolutely monolithic PHP applications. We were hitting about 2,000 users a day, and we had sold about 30,000 of our hardware products in the fleet. We had around 50 developers, I think is what we were talking about. And to be honest, it was a complete free-for-all. It was an absolute mess. Absolute mess. So now this is our actual office environment. We have around 8 development offices. We have 7 different products that we're selling. We have 13 Symfony applications. We've decided that we're standardizing on Symfony across the board. We're now at our websites are having about 11,000 users daily. We've sold 70,000 of those same hardware products that are now in the field, and we have 2 brand new hardware offerings and a bunch of services. So how did we make this jump over a very relatively short amount of time for a company from 2,000 users to 11? Why did we make these major changes in our application structure from going from just basic PHP applications to 13 Symfony apps and managing all of those? And where did we mess up? So how can we help you to not make those mistakes? So I'm going to start at the beginning. This is probably everyone's biggest nightmare of coming into an environment, and that is we had 3 tightly coupled spaghetti code PHP applications, 1 production database, and they all lived on 1 box, 1 piece of hardware. Our CTO at the time made the joke that you have all your eggs in 1 basket, but you can just watch that basket really, really close, and then everything will be great. So we were starting to see a lot of scaling problems. And it wasn't necessarily the vertical scaling, because we hadn't hit the edge of this box. We actually had 512 gigabytes of RAM on this 1 box. So we had done a lot of work on this. But we were seeing the issues with maintainability. We were seeing a lot of issues with bugs within our code. And we were seeing things that were breaking between our different applications because they were so tightly coupled. So we knew we needed to make some changes. One of our senior engineers at the time, and this happened about when I started the company, when I joined, he looked into a bunch of different frameworks, PHP frameworks, and we chose Symfony. It was going to fix all of our problems. We were going to start this new framework. It was going to be great. Now, thankfully, Symfony does give you a lot of big benefits, and I'm going to talk about those, but it doesn't fix all of your problems, and there are a lot of things that you have to do with it to make it. So the biggest thing that we had to figure out when we started was, do we refactor or do we rewrite our application? Now, I know Jonathan earlier today said they rewrote their application into Symfony, and so we actually did both of these things depending on which product group that you looked at. There are a lot of pros and cons to doing both rewriting or refactoring your applications. It's a really big decision, and it's going to take a lot of work regardless which one of these you choose. And sadly, there's not really a right or a wrong answer, so I'm not going to be able to give you the perfect situations for each one. But I am going to touch on some of the pros and cons that we saw. First, I'm going to start about rewriting. When I say rewriting, I do mean this iteratively. I don't mean rewriting everything all at once and only deploying your application once it's been fully rewritten and it's perfect in this new environment. You're going to have to be able to do this over time. So some of the big pros for rewriting is that you actually get to utilize your framework right away. You get to start with a really good structure. You get to make sure that everything is set up in the way that you want it to be. You get a lot of big wins up front on the technical side. You have everyone going in the same direction. On the other side, there's a lot of pain of making sure that your sites look and feel the same if you're doing this iteratively. Maybe you need to worry about authentication between these two sites. And then you have to finish the rewrite. And this is something that you start to see down the path, is that getting those last final tools that are being used in your legacy application, it's really hard to juggle that versus your new feature work that you have going. On the other hand, you have refactoring. Refactoring in the beginning can be very, very difficult. You have to be able to utilize this framework and integrate it in with this coupled spaghetti code, and it can be really hard to actually make use of your framework as you want it. Ideally, you'd like to follow the strangler pattern, but sometimes that just doesn't work right out of the box. Also, it requires a lot of testing for your initial releases because you have to make sure that those small pieces that you've maybe untangled, they don't break something else that you didn't know about. But once you get into this and you get through your rewrite, you get through the refactor of the initial release, it actually does get easier as you get farther down. Like I mentioned, the strangler pattern of being able to slowly strangle your old application and get rid of all the pieces that were within it. One of the big pros that we found with utilizing Symfony is that you can actually use a bunch of the libraries and the components without actually having to use the whole magic of the container. I know Ryan would say it's not magic, but we all know there's magic there. So you can actually utilize certain things that maybe you need prior to using dependency injection or all of these extra pieces. So you're like, all right, Kristen, that's great, but how do I know which one I choose? And there really is no perfect answer. I think you have to look at your environment, you have to ask a lot of really hard questions, and you have to include the business in these questions. You have to make sure that what you're going to be able to deliver will be something that will allow you to continue your project. You don't want to get stopped right through and be told, oh, that rewrite, yeah, you have to end it, because that's not really helping you. And the same with refactoring. But what I can say is that implementing a new framework when you're coming from nothing is really useful and can actually really help. So another thing that we didn't discuss this up front, but it's something that I think we wish that we would have looking back, is utilizing an ORM. ORMs are really awesome, and having Doctrine built right into Symfony can be incredibly useful, especially if you have a greenfield application. You have these, you can start from scratch. You can build your database exactly the way you want it to be. You can model it after your classes that you have in your application. So useful. Or, if you're starting and you have a relatively small app, maybe a very straightforward database, it's pretty well designed, you don't have a lot of hierarchy or mapping, it can be really easy to just plop Doctrine in there. You don't have to actually expand your developer's knowledge to maybe really know a lot about the database, about SQL, or the inner workings of it. It's like, awesome, nice, we're going to use Doctrine, we're very happy. Sadly, on our side, we didn't actually have that luxury. Like I said, you can tell from our beginning, we started in from a pretty rotten place. We had this absolutely massive database. We still do. It was running about 7,000 queries a second. We had a ton of things that were over-normalized. We had a bunch of tables that were way under-normalized with 200 plus columns. There was no structure at all. There was hierarchy that was all over the place. And we started really trying to go down the path of using Doctrine and working through it. And we realized that it was causing us a lot of time to be able to get our mapping correctly and to be able to utilize Doctrine to all the ways that you can. It's absolutely possible, and you get a lot of benefits from that. But there's something that you have to think about on being able to deliver some value for your business and for your teams of standardizing on something that is maybe just utilizing straight queries or things that maybe you were doing in your old applications. So, yay, we have a Symfony app. We've started, we're so excited. We have a good framework. We know what we're using. Things work in our environment. We're going, so let's talk about the thing that everyone loves to hate and knows they need, but no one really wants to actually do, and that's standards. So standards can be a lot of different things. I'm going to talk on two specific pieces, and that's build checks and the structure of your application. So first, let's talk about structure. Any sort of framework that you use is going to give you a very basic structure. Gives you an outline of where all of your things should live, where your config files go, where your business logic should live. It's perfect. But you have the ability to do whatever you want with it. Within those constraints, you can kind of make anything, the application any way that you want. As you start to grow your teams, having something that's standardized across the board makes it a lot easier for your developers to focus on the business logic and on what they're delivering, rather than about where they're putting this class. This is going to be something I'm going to harp on a lot, is that the biggest goal for us as teams is to be able to deliver things and focus on the things that make our applications different. And that's your business logic. It's how your site looks and feels. It's not about the naming conventions of your class, about whether you use annotations or YAML. Those are important because then your team doesn't have to think about them. So this can be a ton of different things in Symfony. Like I just mentioned, annotations versus YAML. You can use that for routing. You can use that in your Doctrine mappings. We also have the way you can structure your config files. Do you separate them out and do you import them, or do you have one massive config file? What about your JavaScript libraries that you use? Do you use TypeScript? Do you use Webpack or Encore? How are you building these libraries? These are things that your team doesn't need to think about. And then one of the biggest ones that we found when we were looking at our applications is structuring your source directory. Now, pretty much everything lands in your source directory. And so we had two examples, and these were two of our different applications. The one on the left, I think, is a more generic one that we see a lot. You know, all of your entities and your plain objects are together. Your repositories are all together, and your services are kind of just grouped in this one area. It's great. You know, you kind of know exactly where to look for. Oh, I need to modify a service. I need to modify a database query. Very straightforward. Then on the other side, you have this more business logic grouping. You have all of your customer entities together. So it's your service, your repository, and your plain old object all in one spot. Now, this can be great. And I've also seen where you don't have these redundant names, where you have just repository that includes customer in the namespace, and you're just supposed to infer that. Any of these really will work for your team. It's up to you to decide what you like, what you don't like, and to be honest, just make up your mind. Make your decision and stick with it. Your structure is really only good for you and only gives you a lot of benefits if you actually enforce it. And the easiest way to do that is through build checks and through continuous integration. Now, I know we all have had that continuous integration. You work really hard on a pull request, you push it up, and your build fails because of linting. You missed a space somewhere, or you didn't follow all the PSR2. So that's incredibly important when you're looking at these things, and you don't need to focus on those things. You just have a build that maybe manually even will automatically fix those things for you. So linting, unit tests, mess detection, we all know them. We all know that they're very important. And anything you read is going to tell you, put those in up front. Start off your application right. Make sure you're doing everything the right way. But when you're in an actual business environment, sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes you're struggling to meet a deadline, and there's just no way that you can spend the time to get your build up to par. Maybe you don't even have time to build in your continuous integration. Maybe you're just r-syncing your files to your web server. Those are totally fine. You just need to have that in mind of what you're going to do. So when do you start standardizing? We started up front with just some manual checks. We knew we follow PSR2, and we were going to enforce unit tests within the Symfony framework. So we made those part manual things you had to follow, but the developers on the team were the ones that should be enforcing it. We then started running the unit tests just to make sure, once we started seeing some breaking changes or things that could have been easily caught, we started running those during the build. Then we added linting. We added some actual basic checks to our pull requests so that you could see it every single time. And we've iterated on that a lot. As we've had arguments between things, or what should be our standards, what do we like, what do we don't, we've changed them, we've added to them to make sure that now you have everything set straightforward, you know you don't have to focus on that. And then we added mess detection finally, and that just gives you a lot of positives, that, you know, to making sure that everything is not complex. So for us, our big red flags were we started seeing people code reviewing and focusing solely on the linting changes. You know, I'm sure we've all seen that. You push up your thing and someone just comments that you missed some linting small detail, and you're like, okay, great, but what about my business logic? Is that correct? Am I actually architecting this in the right way? We also had code reviews where people would get incredibly annoyed at each other around something as simple as a trailing comma, because everyone has their strong opinions, and each person, whether the person putting up the PR or reviewing, feels the need that is, you have to go my way. Those were our big red flags that said, okay, you know what, we need to build these we need to make this standardized, we need to build it into our build, and we need to set it so that you can sit it and forget it, and you don't even have to argue about it anymore. We've agreed in one spot. We also, like I said, we noticed we were having a lot of breaking releases. We were having things that were touching small areas of code and breaking somewhere else, easily caught by unit tests, and not just unit tests that are written for coverage, but actual unit tests that test your negative cases and your positive ones. And then sadly, when we looked at adding mess detection, this is where adding up front can be really positive. We did not add it up front, and we started realizing we had services with like greater than 10 dependencies, and these functions that were just absolutely massive. And when you go to add mess detection, then you have to turn on allow failure to be true, because you can't just fix everything at once. But they are important red flags to kind of look for. If you see any of these things, maybe it's worth adding this to your environment. So continuous integration, a lot of these standards, they helped us get into a lot more stable state. And in the process, we also actually split up our websites into multiple different application servers, which is awesome for scalability. We put them behind HA proxy. We're really excited. We can horizontally scale. We were starting to see some of our upper limits. But the minute you start horizontally scaling, you start running into a lot of other issues that you didn't even foresee when you only have one web server. And those are things around monitoring and infrastructure. So Michael talked a lot about logs and getting all of that data, and all of that is so important. And when you have one web server, man, it is so easy to look at your logs. You just log in at the one place and look at them. The minute you have more than one, you actually have to aggregate your log data across all of these servers. You have to be able to follow your request from one place to another. Maybe you have round robin turned on in HA proxy, and so you could have your request come in on one machine and then the second one right afterwards on a different one. You have to be able to see this user as they go through your system. You also need to know, is your hardware working? Is your infrastructure actually holding up? How many requests are you getting per second? And are they taking a long time just because maybe you haven't tuned your Apache settings? So for us, aggregating all of our logs and being able to have a constant format was really important. These are things that impacts teams outside of just your development team. Now, maybe some of us, we have AWS, we have, Azure, and our teams do it all. We handle all of everything in the cloud, the Apache settings. But other of us, we have infrastructure teams that actually build up your monitoring stack, that maybe do it across multiple teams and not just yours. So being able to give them one consistent way to deal with your applications, makes adding new services, adding new applications very, very straightforward. Also, when you start to scale horizontally and move some things, decouple your applications, we started seeing business logic scaling problems. We started having to make our feature changes into 2 or maybe even 3 applications. We also started seeing that we were having big inconsistencies between the different apps. One maybe said that the price was, $350 because it had some extra rules associated with it, where the other site said it was $275. The business never knew which was right, which was wrong. The customers were confused. It was causing a lot of problems. So one of the big things that I started when I took over this role of principal engineer is to build a service-oriented architecture. I'm not going to go into the details of a SOA. I think a lot of us know what they are or know about them, but the biggest thing about service-oriented architecture is having a standard way that you interface with your services. That's why most SOAs use a service bus. Just all the services connect to this one thing. We knew we didn't want to use a service bus, and we knew we wanted to stick with Symfony. So we decided to build all of ours as web service APIs. But based on the service-oriented architecture, we knew we needed to standardize on them. We needed one way that you could interact with every single one of these APIs. So we started looking at what we had currently, our APIs. We thought, we'll just mimic what we have in production. Well, it turns out we had both REST and JSON RPC APIs. We had no versioning in any of our APIs, or if they did have versioning, it was always version 1, and there was no backwards compatibility. We also had all different forms of authentication, everywhere from just basic auth to HMAC to JWT. Some of them were stored in the database, some of them were stored in config files. There was nothing that made sense across any of them. So me and one other engineer sat down, and we came up with this idea, and we called it cookie cutter. This was our solution to this problem of a standard architecture across the board. So cookie cutter for us is just an application template. It's a library. It's essentially something that's built on top of Symfony for us that gives you the pieces so that your applications all look and feel the same, and all you have to care about is the business logic underneath. It takes away all of the pain of setting things up. You don't have to worry about versioning or routing or authentication. It just works right out of the box. Very similar to the Symfony framework, just adds a couple of things that we wanted. So our requirements when we sat down to build this, we standardize on Symfony 3.4 and PHP 7.0. Now, we realize we're not on Symfony 4 yet, and that's because we're waiting for the LTS version to come out, and then we'll upgrade. Being on a larger environment and a large scale, it's really important for us to be able to have that support for a long period of time. We also standardized on PHP 7.0 because we're using Ubuntu 16.04 across our whole environment. And actually, kind of a fun fact, Datto was one of the key reasons that PHP 7 got put into 16.04. We actually had one of our engineers pulled off full-time to work with Canonical to make sure that got in. It was something that we really pushed for and we really wanted. So we're going to use that until we can move to 18.04 or even 20.04, depending on when that comes out. We also knew we wanted things for outside of the development teams. So standardizing on logging on our metrics stores, making sure that those teams could deal with one application. They didn't really have to think about these extra nuances of anything new as we started to build up all of these different services. We also added basic routing. And the basic routing we just built on top of Symfony. We added extra version support So it would add versioning off the bat, and it could lock your routes to specific versioning. We also chose HMAC authentication. And this was something that we did a lot of research on, and we may be tweaking and changing over the next couple years, but it just mattered that it was standard. And HMAC so that it wasn't replayable. That's why we went at that instead of basic. We also added rate limiting and caching into this application. There's just, we all, in all of our applications, we integrate with Memcache, so we built that caching layer in there automatically so that you were able to use that. And then rate limiting, just to be able to see the expense of your application. How expensive are each one of these requests and how were they working? So we did all that, we built a bunch of applications, and now we're in the spot where we have a lot of that we can grow on. This is something that we've just started within probably the past 6 to 8 months. So we have 3 to 4 services in production. We're very happy with them, but there's a lot of work that we can do. We looked at API framework, and there were some things that we liked and some things we didn't. But we're hoping to open source our cookie cutter app so that everyone else can give us feedback, see what they like, maybe integrate it back into API platform, see where we can go from there. So overall, really, there are no right answers. I wish there was, because that would sure make all of our lives a lot easier, but that's why they pay us a lot of money, right? Is so that we can figure these things out for them. I think for us, the biggest successes that I've seen over the past years is that we were flexible. We were able to make the changes when we saw that we needed them. We saw when we needed to standardize, and we took that. We didn't say, oh, maybe later, or maybe this is not the right time. We saw the pain and we just said, this is important. Let's bite the bullet and just do it. On the other side, we definitely standardized too late. We could have added mess detection earlier. We could have added linting earlier. And those are things you're going to hear from a lot of people. That doesn't mean that if I went back, I would do it all over again. I'm not sure. There were reasons we didn't at the time. But if we would do it earlier if we could. Also, monitoring your applications. We have not been good. And Michael mentioned taking all of your logs. We have been horrible about that in the past. Within the last year, we've been making sure that we're consuming all of our logs and being able to actually look at them. They give you so much information. And just monitoring your infrastructure can be so important to realize how long your requests are taking. Is it your static assets that are causing your page load to be long? What can you look at? What can you improve upon? How can you make your experience better of your site? And then, not rewriting the universe. Obviously, we could have used API platform probably and just modified that a little bit. If we could go back, maybe we would. Maybe we'd still keep what we did and just utilize Symfony and just add some basic tweaks on top of it that maybe we'll be able to contribute back in the future. But those are important things. Use the libraries that are out there. There are so many good things that you can work with, that you can add on. Now, we've made a lot of progress since I started in 2015. I'm really happy with where we are, but we have a long way to go, like I said. We're starting SOC 2 compliance, and we're starting a bunch of extra security work as we continue, our company continues to grow. If you have any questions about what we do, if you have any questions about Datto or about things that we've hit, please feel free to come chat with me afterwards. And any questions?
So, if I understand, cookie cutter is kind of like a boilerplate for the business logic. Is that right?
It's a boilerplate that allows you to work on the business logic. It just takes away everything that you don't necessarily need to work on, like setting up your routing or.
So, the other questions that's related to that is that if you use the boilerplate, how you kind of handles the version updates from Symfony and deprecations, how you migrated that changes to whatever you build on top of cookie cutter?
Yeah, great question. So the question was about version upgrades with Symfony and deprecation notices. So that's one of the big reasons that we wait until there's an LTS version that's out before we actually do any upgrades. And so what we actually try to do is upgrade a lot of our application architecture all around the same time. That obviously doesn't work all of the time, especially as you continue to grow. But it is something that we've been very mindful about. We don't want to fall that far behind. We actually just upgraded to PHP 7 within the last year. We were PHP 5.3 before that, and seeing the pain that we had moving from the legacy applications of 5.3 to 7.0, we've kind of vowed that we're not going to let that happen again. Now, that's not going to say that it won't, but ideally we'll update Cookie Cutter, and that will update Symfony, and it kind of hides a lot of the Symfony pieces underneath and abstracts some of the routing and some of the pieces that we're utilizing. So hopefully it will make those business logic upgrades, unless there are specific libraries within Symfony that are changed, that we can still continue to use those, and it'll just be a simpler upgrade in the application. Any other questions?
How many apps do you expect to put on this Cookie Cutter? Tens or dozens?
I would say probably dozens. Our business logic, our company is expanding a lot, and so separating out pieces into macro services, we're not going into any microservices or anything in the near future, but just separating out those larger pieces that all of our applications use. So I think we've identified about 10 right now that are key ones for us to do over the next year or two. I'm sure by when that happens, there's going to be 10 more, but yeah.
What do you see yourself gaining by using API platform?
I have a lot of developers that are really excited about GraphQL and about using a kind of standardized language across the board. Kind of gives you that RPC-ish experience within your REST APIs, and being able to query for very specific data structures within that. So filtering on exactly what columns and things you want back within your entities, I think can be really, really beneficial when you have 3 applications that are using roughly the same data. They're using the same data underneath, but maybe they just want 5 less columns, or a couple things that they don't need from the entity. It can be nice for those purposes. I think also just working on something that's open source and is contributed on by a lot of people, I think always gives you security benefits, some things that just within your own team you may not think about. Yeah.
Do you have any strategies to get management buy-in to do stuff like this? Squeaky wheel?
Yes. I think you have to show the pieces as to where you see the pain, and make it show them where it's hurting them. For us, it was a lot of bugs that we started seeing, and like I said, with tightly coupled applications, you see that a lot. So if you can start being that person that's like, hey, we could fix this if we did it this way, and then you start calling it out every single time it happens, and you just kind of put it in the people's mind, you can get buy-in that way. It's not easy, but you just have to be able to prove in their terms of what would help, how it would help them, how it would be beneficial for them.
Just a curious question. How do you try to, like you mentioned, there are a lot of useful resources outside and don't rewrite the universe. So what's good strategies of looking out for good resources? Like, do you use any with your methods, apart from the Symfony app that you have?
Yeah, so we look a lot on the Symfony app, the Symfony website. We actually work really closely with Ryan Weaver. He's come to our office, I don't know, 5 or 6 times over the past couple years. And so we work really closely with him on making sure that our applications are up to standards, and kind of he reminds us of things that we forget a lot. And which is really useful. I think the other thing is, when you go into developing something new, a lot of these things are really easy to find. You just kind of have to do one Google search. And if you do one Google search and you don't find anything, then, go for it, go down the path. But most of these things, if you're looking for something specific, they're either going to be there or they're not. Awesome. Well, thank you all very much.